Okay, so this is a Raspberry Pi, but what actually is a Raspberry Pi? So all a Raspberry Pi is a little miniature computer. It has all of the things that your laptop or your desktop computer has, but a lot smaller. It has its processor, it has its memory, it has storage, it has everything. But how do we actually use this little computer? So the first thing we need is an operating system. On your laptop, you might use Mac OS. On your desktop, you might use Windows. But what we use on a Raspberry Pi is Linux, which is an alternative operating system. More specifically, we use the Raspbian distribution of Linux, which is a specific type of Linux made for Raspberry Pis. So the way we boot this onto the Raspberry Pi is we use a micro SD chip, which you can see here, and we put that in the slot that is on the top of the Raspberry Pi. So let's see what other ports we have. We have a micro USB power port, an HDMI port to plug it into a monitor. We have an audio jack to use headphones, a few USBs, and an Ethernet port. And then finally, you have these pins here on this other side. And these are GPIO pins, which are a little bit confusing, but pretty much they allow us to interact with other stuff, like we can plug in lights, we can plug in our case, pumps, and that type of thing. So let's plug in some peripherals. Here I have a power cord, which is a micro USB, which I just plug in. And you can see, once you plug it in, you should see some flashing lights up at the top. And there should be two distinct flashing lights here. You see there's the red light, which means that power is going to it. And there's also a green light flashing there. And that one means there's CPU activity. So that means our operating system was loaded successfully. If you don't see those two lights, try some troubleshooting stuff online. But you should see two lights flashing once you plug it in. So let's actually try and use the computer. So we'll plug in a keyboard, which is obviously necessary. And then we'll also plug in a mouse, because how else are we going to use it? And then once we plug in a monitor, it should work. It should load up and it should look like a regular computer. But before you plug in a monitor, you have to unplug the power source. So we'll unplug the micro USB and then plug in the monitor. And then we can plug in the micro USB again, and it should boot up to the monitor if your monitor is turned on and plugged in. So there we go, plug in the power source, and then let's see what's happening on the monitor. So once you plug in your Raspberry Pi to the power source, you'll start to see some output on the monitor after a while. Let it boot up, and just let it go through all the sequence of events until you get to this home screen. And the first thing you want to do is connect to the internet. You can see up in the top right, there's a little internet symbol next to the sound and Bluetooth. So just go through that, connect, as it's necessary to interface with the Raspberry Pi. I'm ready to connect. So from there, what you want to do is open up a terminal window, which you can see is up at the top here. And once you have that open up, what you want to type in is sudo apt-get update and sudo apt-get upgrade. This might ask for your password. Just enter the default password. I believe it's Raspberry, but it could be wrong. So if that doesn't work, look up Raspberry Pi default password. And what this does is it just brings all the software on your Raspberry Pi up to date and make sure there's nothing wrong with it. So let's let that run for a little bit. Oh, I misspelled it, so make sure you spell it correctly. And then this is going to take a while for you to run because your software, since you've never ran this before, a lot of it's going to be out of date. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be downloaded, and a lot of stuff needs to be installed. But for me, it's not going to take that long because I already did it. But for you, it could take upwards of 10 minutes. So maybe do something else in this time. But let that run. And then when it's finished, what we need to do is enable SSH, which is a service which allows us to connect to the Raspberry Pi from our laptop. So to do this, we type system or sudo systemctl start SSH. This might ask for your password again. Again, enter the default password. And then what you need to do is type hostname taci. And what this gives us is the local IP address of the Raspberry Pi, which is necessary to connect to the Raspberry Pi from our laptop. And then from here, what you might want to do is change the password of your Raspberry Pi, because obviously the default password, everyone knows it. So you could go up into the top left where there's a Raspberry icon and go to preferences and change the password to something you can remember. And that's going to make it a lot safer. This step is optional, but recommended. So from here, we're ready to start writing some code.